Hi, folks. Welcome to another edition of Inside the Marble Palace, Post-Media Saskatchewan's look into Saskatchewan and politics elsewhere. I'm Murray Mandryk, political columnist for the Regina Leader Post and Star Phoenix. With me, as usual, Arthur White-Crummey, our legislative reporter for the newspapers. And joining us today, Alec Salloum. Thank you for joining us, Alex. Alex has covered just a ton of things related to political matters, but more recently related to the rediscovery of the grave sites at Cowessess that we're going to talk mostly about today. But first, I'd like to talk to Arthur briefly about Premier Scott Moe's press conference on COVID-19 yesterday, where we were at with COVID and what the Premier had to say. Generally, where we were at is numbers are going down. Unfortunately, what's not going up as quickly as perhaps hoped is first doses. Second doses seem to be going along very well. But unfortunately, first doses aren't, and we seem to be stalled a little bit. We're opening up anyway. What did the Premier have to say about this, and maybe why he doesn't think we can have more restrictive measures like, say, vaccine passports that we're seeing in Manitoba?
Yeah, so he shifted very much to talking about second doses yesterday, which, as you just noted, is one of the bright spots in terms of the vaccine achievements of the province. He noted that we were the first province to pass the 40% fully vaccinated threshold, and he is confident that 60% of people will be fully vaccinated by the time that the last restrictions drop off on July 11th. But of course, as we all know, we have not yet met the target in terms of first dose vaccinations for actually triggering that return to normal. It's been hovering just under 70% for most of the week. It's now at 69.991 the last time that I looked. So just a few hundred doses really to go here, but we're only getting a few hundred first doses a day at this point. The overwhelming majority, thousands, are coming through second doses. That's still good news, particularly since we're grappling with this, Delta variant, which is showing up a little bit more each day in the genetic sequencing. And we know from studies that have been done elsewhere that it is particularly resistant to a single dose of the vaccine, but can generally be combated quite effectively through the full 2-dose regimen. So that's what we heard from the Premier, kind of a shift to defending his plans based on our 2-dose success. But he also took questions about his hesitancy to look at vaccine passports. And this has become particularly newsworthy for two reasons. One, there was a recent poll out of the University of Saskatchewan that showed that a fairly strong majority of 61% of people were favorable to requiring proof of vaccination for large stadium size events. And we also know that this is something that they're thinking about down in Winnipeg, that the Blue Bombers are going to require people that want to attend their games, at least in the early stages, to have to be 2 weeks out from having gotten their second dose. That's not something that we're seeing here in terms of Mosaic Stadium. We've heard from the Rough Riders that they're just following the provincial guidance, and the overall provincial guidance remains that we don't need vaccine passports. And the way that the Premier explained this yesterday was that based on what he's hearing from the SHA, based on his reading of the law, that would be a privacy violation according to HIPAA to go down that road. So they're not going to do it.
Specific to our legislation, which one might assume would be different than Manitoba's legislation?
I haven't read the Manitoba legislation.
I haven't either. My apologies.
Scott Livingston, the CEO, the SHA, backed up the Premier, saying that as far as he understands the law, it would be there's no requirement for people to provide personal health information beyond the provision of health services, nor can they be asked for it, except for the provision of health services. And vaccine status is, in his view, personal health information.
Before we move on to Alec, I want you to review, if you can, with the people, what the Premier had to say about Canada Day that's coming up tomorrow as of the broadcast, the recording of this. And I thought it was exceptionally poignant from the Premier and pretty important in a sense, because sometimes certain voices saying certain things are far more meaningful than others. And for a Conservative Premier to sit before the mics and say, you know what, maybe it's okay for communities to cancel Canada Day in Saskatchewan, I thought was particularly brave, actually, for the Premier to do so, because there's a huge reluctance, and that's going against political popularity in this province to even suggest that. What did he say, and what was his reasoning, Arthur? Sorry.
Yeah, I found that to be the most surprising part of his answer. I knew that he would call for more reflection, thinking about both the good and the bad in our history, and he did do that. He said that he'll be reflecting on this Canada Day, and people should celebrate however they feel it's appropriate, but with more reflection about the most painful parts of our country's past. What I found surprising is that when asked directly about what he thinks about the few communities that have chosen to either postpone, suspend, cancel Canada Day, he said in those cases it may be, appropriate, which is something that we haven't heard from a lot of Conservative politicians, as you say. One of the most striking quotes that I found kind of surprising is him saying, "This is a great country for the most part," and I'm sure that we can talk about some of the reasons why we need that qualifier.
Alec, you've been following this, and I guess what I'm trying to get a sense of from various reporters that live this story, because that's kind of what we wind up doing when we cover it, is that sometimes they get a sense of a bit of a sea change going on in the public, and I'm wondering if it's too early or if it's overstating to suggest that is happening right now on this particular file. I have just been, ever since the discovery in Kamloops, rather amazed at how many times I've seen people post on social media and in other places things that I would be surprised that they're posting about residential schools, the sudden interest in it, the empathy with the situation. Do you sense a big change going on here, Alec, that you might not have seen before?
Yeah, absolutely, I do, Murray. And I think that the thing that's really interesting to keep in mind with all of this is how quickly this is happening, right? The discovery at Kamloops occurred on May 27th, right? And over the course of a month later, June 24th, we had the discovery at Cowessess. But I mean, over that time, you've had what I'd say is a pretty considerable sea change, right? You've had communities cancel Canada Day. You've had this renewed interest in the calls to action, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as well. And it very much seems like what you'll come across with a lot of reporters that have reported in Indigenous communities, and even people that have just had a degree of exposure to, First Nations, to reserves, to having conversations with elders and survivors of residential schools, is that there's just been an understanding that there are people buried at a lot of these schools, right? You speak with an elder, you speak with a residential school survivor, somebody that went even in 70s, 80s, 90s when bands took over. There's just always sort of been this understanding that it's there. And I mean, even within the TRC, within the calls to action, I do believe it's call 71 to I want to say 78, touch on the need to identify and in some way repatriate almost the remains at the residential school. So there's been this understanding for a very long time, but there hasn't been the scale of Kamloops, right? There have been graves found at the Regina residential school. There have been a few graves found throughout. Muskowhegan did some preliminary ground surveys in, I want to say it was 2018, and found some 30 potential grave sites. But the 215, I think, marked a sea change because they were, for one, children and also just the number of it. You think about a lot of people that are graduating this time of year, and you think about 215 is a fair size graduating class, right? And I think that for a lot of people, just the sheer number has precipitated this change in opinion. And then with Kamloops, 751 unmarked graves is just another one of those monumental figures. And while not all of them are children, and we can get into this later, but Chief Cowessess Salloum of Cowessess First Nation said that this was a Roman Catholic cemetery. There are Catholics buried there. There are non-Indigenous people there. But the understanding still is that the majority of the people there are former attendees rather, of the Maryville residential school.
Let's get into the notion of the traditional opposition and the forces that are in play here, because you've touched on it and you've written several things about this. But because of the religious element, because these were generally religious-based schools, and always schools are largely Roman Catholic-based schools, I think 80%, if I remember correctly, there's an immediate force in terms of criticism of the church that people react to in a different way. And I'm thinking in this particular case, we're dealing with a situation where there's a lot of people that are having a hard time understanding or accepting this because it goes against their religious foundation and what they believed, or what they grew up to believe was the right reason for doing this. What are you finding in relation to both how people that have religious convictions and how the church itself is reacting to this, Alec?
Well, speaking from two perspectives here. So, Bishop Donald Boland, with the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Regina, since he came into the role in 2016, has been trying to work very, very hard with residential schools and has issued an apology. And in 2016, tried to get the Pope to come to the province to apologize. He said that at the time, it was a very small group of Saskatchewan bishops who didn't really have the weight to throw around to get the Pope to come here and to apologize. But recently, we've seen renewed interest in doing that. Post Kamloops, the Canadian Commission of Catholic Bishops ended up putting together a bit of a steering community and reaching out to the Vatican, and have confirmed that by the end of the year, there's going to be a sit down with the Pope and elders, residential school survivors, Indigenous youth, and knowledge keepers. So in terms of what's going on within that sphere, it seems like there has been a motivation or a bit of a renewed conviction to address the calls to action and to act in the interest of reconciliation. The Missionary Oblates of Mary Immaculate are another group that ran both the school at Kamloops and Cowessess, and they have committed to releasing all of their records when possible. You mentioned issues around privacy, and that's one of the issues that faces the Oblates as well, is that Father Ken Thorson said essentially they will give every document that they have possession of or that they can track down, so long as it comports with the charter rights of the brotherhood, of the priests, of the members. So what that means is something like what's called the Codex Historicus is going to be made public, and that's a daily journal from the Oblates that they would record from their schools, etc. But when it comes to what individual Catholics might be thinking, or what individual Christians might be thinking going through this, I think that it's probably part of the reason that we're having the conversations that we are, is that the discoveries at Cowessess, the discovery at Kamloops, run so counterfactual to what a lot of people view their religion to be. And I think that that's caused tremendous and understandable discord with a lot of people in their religious conceptions. And the other side of it too is that we've seen, I do believe this morning in Edmonton, there was a report of another church being burnt down. We've seen a lot of frustration, we've seen a lot of anger, and we've seen vandalism in Saskatoon at St. Paul's Cathedral, and then in Regina at the Sisters Legacy statue in Wascana Park. Both of them doused with red and orange paint, and a number of demonstrations occurring like that. So there's been a fairly considerable response from members of the community and those outside to this news.
This is a very thoughtful reflection. I thank you for that, Alec, because I'd like to get back a little bit more in terms of what it means and how it moves forward. But Arthur, you've done something on this specifically, and it fascinated me at the time, and that was how quickly this story was grasped by an international audience. At that press conference, we had reporters from all over, like, and I mean all over the world, in relation to this. Tell us about that, and maybe if you can, what do you think it means in terms of how this story will move forward, given the fact that it seemingly has this international interest, at least initially?
Yeah. So just to start, on the press conference that day, we filled up to capacity. There were 300 people on the call. It couldn't take anymore. There were people from ZDF, which is the German public broadcaster. There was a Spanish journalist, several American journalists. There was Ruptly, which is, I would call, a Russian propaganda outlet. Other people might differently. But then I did a review of where this story actually wound up after that press conference, and it was all around the world, with varying degrees of accuracy and depth and thoughtfulness. But certainly we saw it in Germany, we saw it in Spain, we saw it in France, major newspapers, major media outlets, and they dealt with it a little bit differently. One thing that I did find surprising was that Bobby Cameron made some really strong statements, calling these Canada's concentration camps, saying that we had concentration camps here in Saskatchewan. As far as I could tell, and I reviewed every major German news outlet that I'm aware of, I did not see anyone pick that up or make any comparisons. But that being said, there was coverage that was very, very critical about Canadian history, very critical about the role of the church. And you saw this particularly in some of the U.S. media, because they're beginning to grapple with their own history down there. They, of course, also had boarding schools. They also have questions about what might have gone on there, and whether they may have their own high death rates and their own tragic discoveries to make. So their Interior Secretary has recently set out an upcoming investigation to try to see if they can make some of the same discoveries that we've recently made here. And I talked to a reporter who actually covered the story for CNN's Race and Equity team, I believe it's called, and she was particularly interested in the story because of those connections. She thinks that this is something that is obviously a huge issue here and is likely to become a huge issue in the United States. So what I found particularly interesting about that story and about the international coverage is just the way that different countries with their own dark histories that they've done a more or less good job of coming to terms with, probably better in the German case, worse in the United States case, the way that they did or did not, connect our tragedy with their own.
That's interesting, and because of this, and you've written about it, and Alec has also written about it, this story is going to get increased scrutiny where every development related to that press conference, related to what's going forward in terms of what gets covered, will be scrutinized. And Alec, I guess I'd like to ask you about some of those things. There is a question about the accuracy of the ground penetrating radar and what that means in terms of a 10% or 15% margin of error, that we might only see 600 or so graves at Cowessess. There's the question of whether this was a public cemetery. There's also the question of whether there was something horribly nefarious about the removal of the headstones, or whether this was just something that was done for various reasons, up to and including the need to repair them and repair the grave markers, and then for whatever reason just not being replaced. Now, all that flies in the face of the simple notion to me is that when I send my kids to school, I expect them to come home at night. I expect them to not die in schools, and that seems to have registered quite dramatically with a lot of people. Those two notions are in ugly conflict right now. So where do you see that debate really happening in terms of the intense detail? And does it really matter in the greater scheme of things, or are people just now simply getting the notion that regardless of what the number actually is, this was a horrific event, and whether it's 600 or 500 or 751 at Cowessess, it's an event in our history that's a blotch, and that we have to come to terms with? Where do you see the story going from the actual factual details and how it might play out in the public mind?
I think that what we're seeing is a lot less apologia for residential schools. And in previous cases, it seems like there have been a few people that are still saying, like, in some way that people will still endorse them and say that they're from the outset they had a noble intention, but the execution was poor. You're seeing a little bit less of that. I'd say you're actually seeing considerably less of that. The issue with that ground penetrating radar is that it is, as you mentioned, there's the possibility for a 10% margin of error. It can't necessarily identify what exactly is in the ground. It can plot out changes in soil composition, right? When you dig a grave, there's oxidization of the ground. There's a specific trace as well, right? There's a meter by whatever dimension in the ground. So that's more or less what this radar was able to identify, is that there is a plot here, and then as for who's buried, that's still a lingering question. That's part of the reason why the records are so important. And with the oblates, they'll have potentially complete or incomplete death records, attendance records, etc., and then you can compare it to who came back and who didn't. As for just people coming to terms with the fact that, yeah, these were schools and people died there. I mean, I don't see people necessarily excusing it, especially now. But like you mentioned, there are some questions with Cowessess about, who all is buried there. And speaking with Chief DeLorme, he said that from accounts from elders and accounts from survivors, that there are just people from surrounding communities that are buried there too. And at no point during the conference did he say that all 751 are children. He also never said that this was a mass grave. He said that it's an unmarked grave site. Yeah. So
he made a point of that.
Absolutely. Repeat it. And he's restated it a number of times, because when we talk about the amount of international attention this has received, I mean, there's been misreporting of even the number of unmarked graves that have been found in a few cases. So I think that the difficulty coming out of this is going to be, why were those stones gone, right? Because again, the oral history and what we've heard, even from somebody like Bishop Boland, is that it could have been a dispute with the school, the band, and a groundskeeper. It could have been a dispute of some kind that led to this. It could have been that they were being taken down to be cleaned and were never put back up. But again, that's part of the incomplete picture that we have of what happened there, and part of the reason why these records and correspondences are so required and necessary to get a better idea of what happened and why at Maryville and within Cowessess.
This is so fascinating to me, and I think we could probably talk about this for a considerable longer time, but unfortunately this is all the time we have today. So I hope we can get back to this, and thanks for your depth of understanding and reporting on this, because I think we covered ground today that a lot of people didn't really appreciate or understand in terms of the depth of this story. Such as it is, happy Canada Day. Lots in this country to be proud of, but as Premier Scott Moe said, lots to be reflective of. Arthur, Alec, thank you so much for your time, and we'll talk to you soon on Inside the Marble Palace.